If it all went tits up, what would you do?
What, everything?
Yeah.
I've had a situation in my life where I was down to my last 2,000 quid, and
How old were you?
it wasn't too long ago.
Oh, really?
And I just thought, I woke up one day and I was like, oh, I'm still alive. You know, it's all right, isn't it?
You're kind of stuck though. I mean, what, you haven't got any legal skills or accountancy skills, or you're dependent on your.
Yeah, but you know, I think there's room for everybody. You know, if the world wants to not hire you because you think like I think, which I think is fairly reasonable. I don't think I'm particularly. In fact, I know what I am. What I say is what I am. I think it's reasonable. If the world doesn't want to hire me for those opinions, then I don't want to work for you guys.
Right.
For the world. I mean, what's the point?
Right.
You don't want to go into a work environment and have someone thought police you at work, do you?
So, if you were drawn to this video primarily due to the Doctor Who reference, then let me first say that I will absolutely provide evidence that entirely supports my admittedly clickbaity title, and I'll also be pointing to evidence of direct race discrimination emanating from behind the scenes of that particular show. But let me first set out the main purpose of this video, which is the latest in an occasional series examining evidence of systemic isms within the BBC. So in this episode I intend to examine matters arising from Laurence Fox's recent appearance on Question Time in the context of the BBC and associated parties' commitment to diversity, inclusion and maintaining a safe space for all. And to do that most effectively, I'll begin with a summary of the relevant details arising from the incident that shall henceforth be known as the Laurence Fox Question Time kerfuffle.
I mean, obviously as an actor, you have to fly all over the place.
Yeah, the carbon footprint's huge, but we make up for it by preaching to everyone how they should change their life.
So, Laurence Fox is an English actor and singer-songwriter who's best known for his lead role in the independent British TV drama series Lewis. He's a member of the Fox family who have been involved in acting professions for a number of generations and as a consequence has been described as both privileged and posh. On the 16th of January 2020, he appeared as a guest on the BBC's topical political debate programme Question Time as one of 5 panel members intended to represent a cross-section of differing political opinions and cultural views. His appearance provoked significant comment and debate on social media. Much of this was supportive of his so-called anti-woke, straight-talking perspective, but then again, much of it wasn't, and Fox was accused of, amongst other things, being rude, ill-informed, racist, sexist, and perhaps worst of all, a white privileged male.
In the studio, the man who, wow, really got the country into yet more battles. Forget Brexit. No, the divide over what Laurence Fox had to say on Question Time last Thursday appears to have completely divided the nation.
Following broadcast, the BBC reported that they had received a total of 253 complaints about the programme, which further fueled media reporting of the ensuing fallout. A number of media outlets attributed these complaints to Fox's controversial race row about Meghan Markle, although as I'll explain later, this doesn't appear to be an entirely accurate interpretation of what the complaints were actually about. I'll leave a link to the entire broadcast so that you can make your own mind up about who was naughty or nice, but my interpretation of the key points would be this. Following the question, should the Duke and Duchess of Sussex be able to profit commercially from their royal status now that they have retired from public duties, an audience member proposed that the press criticism of Meghan Markle specifically was motivated by racism, and presumably by inference that this was the reason her family were leaving the UK. Fox disagreed. He proposed that the UK was the most tolerant, lovely country in Europe, and stated that it's so easy to throw the charge of racism at everybody, and it's really starting to get boring. The audience member then stated that she was troubled by his comments. She described Fox as a white privileged male, and proposed that he had never experienced racism and therefore could not dismiss her perspective. Fox groaned in reaction to being described as a white privileged male and proposed that her dismissal of his statement solely on the basis of immutable characteristics that he was born with was in and of itself a racist act.
You are a white privileged male who has no I mean, can I
I
just...
can't help what I am. I was born like this. It's an immutable characteristic. So to call me a white privileged male is to be racist. You're being racist.
You cannot dismiss... Okay.
A significant cross-section of the audience applauded Fox's comments and also groaned at the pejorative use of the term straight white male. Additional relevant context to the debate that followed is that the chair observed that the Home Secretary, who is also a woman of colour, disagreed that the press coverage had been racist. A female woman of colour in the audience expressed her belief that Meghan Markle, or people speaking on her behalf, were playing the race card in response to criticism that they didn't want to hear. Labour's Baroness Shamri Chakrabarti, another woman of colour, stated that she would never say that a white man cannot have a perspective on such matters, and also asked Fox to consider the perspective of people with different immutable characteristics to his own. She also supported the view that Markle had been a victim of racism, citing an analysis presented by BuzzFeed on the matter. And the one male audience member out of the 6 that were invited to contribute to the discussion observed that the panel had spent over 10 minutes discussing a multimillionaire family who exist on state subsidies and asked that they move on to more important matters.
One of the dangerous things about throwing racism around in this country, which we're doing a lot at the moment, is people become so conscious of it that things like the Manchester grooming scandal get ignored.
Finally, and in what may have been the most significant side comment of them all, in my humble subjective opinion, Shamri Chakrabarti implied that Fox's comments could be interpreted as saying that there is no racism in the country and that there are no issues in the press.
You know, loving your country doesn't mean that you say there is no racism in the country and there are no issues in the press. Forgive me.
And this is exactly how a significant number of Fox's detractors certainly came to interpret his words, along with the perception that he thought racism was boring, including actor, writer, musician and self-identifying militant East Asian Daniel York Low, who incidentally also described audience members who applauded Fox as gammon and doesn't consider that specific pejorative term to be a racial slur. I mentioned Daniel specifically because he has a significant role to play in our critical incident. But before I get into all that, let me quickly share some observations from Douglas Murray, who described the kerfuffle as a parable for our times. Murray observed that Fox's appearance was both remarkable and noteworthy, specifically because of his professional background and the reaction from his peers, noting that Fox was not just a member of the acting profession thinking for themselves and expressing themselves articulately, but someone willing and able to stand up and keep their head about them when the would-be totalitarians and censors of the age went about their nasty little business, playing games such as let's pretend that all men are misogynists unless they prostrate themselves to prove otherwise, something which he proposed Baroness Shamri Chakrabarti attempted later in the same broadcast.
And why Kian?
He just looks like he can take Boris on quite well. Do you know what I mean? That's what I get by.
You don't think any of the 4 women would be...
Oh, it's not about women. Jeepers creepers. Sorry.
So I just was interested in your view.
Let me rewind. Any of the women. Is that better?
Murray also pointed out the critical rail world incident that I want to explore, which was that, remarkably, the Actors Union Equity issued a Soviet-style denunciation of Laurence Fox, announcing that they were extremely disturbed that he had been given a publicly subsidised platform to berate a woman of colour, attempting to discuss issues of race and gender discrimination, branding him a disgrace to the industry, and calling on its members to unequivocally denounce him. Just to put this in its proper context, Equity is the trade union for the UK entertainment industry and is hugely influential. One major motivation for actors to pay monthly membership fees to them is that many professional auditions are Equity member-only calls. The call to denounce the actor was issued from Equity's Minority Ethnic Members Committee Twitter account. However, the tweets were then quickly deleted, which led to a public spat spat between Equity's management and members of the committee. At time of broadcast, this is yet to be resolved, but the story so far is essentially as follows. Equity initially claimed that the tweets were sent out by two individuals without the agreement of either Equity or the Minority Ethnic Committee. Two members of the committee, including the aforementioned Daniel York-Lowe, then took to Twitter to deny this, report that they had been locked out of their own accounts, accuse the union of censorship and of chucking its minority ethnic members under the bus. Equity eventually issued a statement acknowledging its decision to remove the tweets, claiming rules had inadvertently been broken, that it was a mistake to criticise a member of the profession without consultation with the union, and that the council would be seeking to resolve the matter in a meeting later that same month. The Minority Ethnic Committee then issued a counter-statement saying that they were disappointed by the official statement issued by Equity, and that they stood by their criticism of behaviour that shut down discussions about racism, which had been done to fulfil their duty to Equity's Safe Spaces statement, specifically, if we are subjected to or witness bullying and harassment, we will speak out. And for the avoidance of doubt, the word denounce is defined by the Cambridge English Dictionary as to criticise something or someone strongly and publicly. Significantly, numerous dictionaries, including Google's own default, offer chillingly different meanings for that word, meanings that one might think a self-identifying militant East Asian may very well be aware of, along with the cultural connotations of calling on a body of people to do that word onto another. Here's a quick clip of Daniel discussing the matter on Radio 4.
Why would it be right for a group of actors representing a part of the union to have any opinion on this at all?
Because, I mean, I think if we you know, it's a public broadcast, and a member of our profession is closing down a discussion about racism, saying, no, you can't call it racism, it's not racism, talking over somebody who's attempting to raise an issue about, you know, something that happened that has worried and concerned a lot of people.
But
So
is your words
that
there puzzle some people? When you say closing down, he had a debate with her on air. He said something, she said something, he said something else. I mean, he didn't say shut up, he didn't stop her speaking, he didn't say how dare you, just he had free speech and you disagree with it.
Actually, what happened is she started to make the point and he says, no, right? It's not racism, factual statement. You can't call it racism. That's a kind of instructive, you know, that's an instruction to me.
Well, it's an opinion, isn't it? I mean, that's what Question Time does. People are asked questions, she asked it, and he expressed an opinion. And are you agreeing with the questioner that, as quotes a privileged white male, he is disqualified from taking a view?
She didn't get that far to say that, did she? I mean, this is the thing. Everybody in this country is entitled to an opinion because it's a democratic country. However, I mean, I could come out with all sorts of profound opinions about how to land rockets on the moon and how to do brain surgery and how to manage trust funds. But, you know, as I've never done any of those things, I wonder how much worth my opinion is. So there's an opinion he can have, but actually what he's doing by 1 minute saying we shouldn't be talking about racism so much and the next minute labeling her as being racist for mentioning the fact he's white and privileged, it seems to me that Laurence is setting himself up as the definitive voice on what is and what isn't racism.
Well, is she not doing exactly that? She is saying that because I am, quotes, a woman of colour, I have got an opinion that's valuable, and your opinion is of no value at all because you are, quotes, and it was what she said, a white privileged male.
She didn't say that, no, Nick.
Well, she did say, what worries me about your comment is that you're a white privileged male who has no experience in this. So I'm not sure what she meant other than, why should we listen to you?
I mean, does he have experience of racism if he's white and male and privileged?
Well, he lives in Britain.
I'm not sure he does.
He doesn't maybe experience it in the sense of he is.
Has he experienced racism?
No, that doesn't mean he experiences directly, of course. No.
Significantly, Equity have yet to clarify whether or not its members should follow the advice of its entire Minority Ethnic Committee and unequivocally denounce Fox for his stated opinions. I suspect that no unequivocal statement will be forthcoming and that members will be left to make up their own minds. mind. Noticeably, the 7-paragraph statement opens with 5 paragraphs devoted to denouncing racism, noting Equity's long, proud history of fighting racism, and even an expression of gratitude and pride from the General Secretary to members of her profession who were prepared to put their heads above the parapet for their fellow members. Something which Douglas Murray might perceive to be akin to playing along to the game of let's pretend that all white people are racist unless they prostrate themselves to prove otherwise. The Minority Ethnic Committee have spoken with one voice about their disappointment with the official statement issued by Equity, and it's possible that Equity may have subsequently denounced their own statement because it has been pulled from their website. But never mind all that. Let's now watch some of Equity's members explain the rather obvious reason why their trade union moved so quickly to delete those tweets, and sort of not entirely supported their Minority Ethnic Committee's call to unequivocally denounce a member of their trade.
Every single one of us working on this project is entitled to work in a safe space.
A space free from fear.
A space free from bullying and harassment of any kind.
We will work together, honouring our differences.
And celebrating the gifts we each bring to the table.
We will treat one another with politeness and respect at all times.
And if we are subjected to or witness bullying or harassment,
we will speak out, knowing that our voices will be heard and we will be taken seriously.
Together, we can create a safe space.
In an odd sense of symmetry, it was none other than the mother of Laurence Fox's children that helped to launch Equity's Safe Space statement, which is now read out to cast and crew at the beginning of most UK productions. And it is this precise statement that the Minority Ethnic Committee have pointed to in one voice as the reason that they put their head above the parapet and unequivocally denounced behaviour that shuts down discussions about racism. An unequivocal position which is problematic for a great many reasons, not least because by denouncing Fox's behaviour, it logically follows that the committee is inviting us to denounce people who behave like him. People like the woman of colour in the Question Time audience who went one step further and suggested that the race card was being played, which presumably is why Equity have at least taken some steps to distance themselves from the committee's perspective, not least presumably in an attempt to show that they are taking reasonable steps to follow their own policy on promoting a safe space for all. Because obviously, regardless of whether they're even a member of Equity, people who behave like Laurence Fox unequivocally fall within the meaning of the word all. Here's a BBC subsidised comedian to drive that point home.
This is the text of the hymn All Things Bright and Beautiful. It's my belief not only is this the worst hymn in the English language, but it's also one of the shittest things ever written by anyone in any language ever. I'm going to explain why that is now, right? This is the chorus up here, which you sing once at the start of the hymn, and then a further 7 times during it. And it's my belief you don't need to do that. I think you can get the idea of what the hymn's about just from reading that through once, I think, right? So I'm going to do that now. I'm going to read it through once. I want you to see if you can understand what the hymn's saying. Look out for key words, all right? Here's how it goes. All things bright and beautiful, all creatures great and small, all things wise and wonderful, the Lord God made them all. The key word is all there. All those things have been made by God. That's what it's saying. It's easy to understand. First verse points out God made each little flower that opens, each little bird that sings, their glowing colours and their tiny wings. So 4 more things there, including a bird. Which you don't need to be told he's made a bird, because you've just been told he made all things there. 2 lines, and that covers a bird, surely. The only situation you'd need to be told he'd made a bird, right, if you'd just been told he made all things, is if you'd read that first bit through, understood what it meant, had some kind of brain hemorrhage, forgotten everything you'd ever known, looked up in the sky, seen a bird and gone, blow me tight, a bird, who could have made that? Because that is covered then. But I like to think of it in mathematical terms here, where... Set A is all things. Set B is birds. Set B is a very clear subset of set A. In fact, I would go so far as to say this needlessly overcomplicates a very simple idea. Because basically you're either a thing, in which case you're in set A, or you don't exist, right?
Perhaps one of the reasons that Douglas Murray came to describe the Laurence Fox Question Time kerfuffle as a parable for our times is that it provides us with a real-world illustration of a warning about the current state of race relations in Western countries that he highlighted in his book, The Madness of Crowds. In the opening section of his chapter on race, he observed two things. Firstly, when MLK Jr. addressed the crowds from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, he appealed not only to foundations of justice in the founding traditions and principles of America, he also made the most eloquent defense anyone has ever made about the right way in which to treat other human beings. He spoke not only after centuries in which black Americans had been first slaves and then second-class citizens, but in an era when racist laws were still on the statute books in American states. Racial laws, including anti-miscegenation laws still in place, able to punish couples from different racial backgrounds who had fallen in love. It was King's great central moral insight that in the future about which he dreamed, his children should one day live in a nation where they will be judged not by the colour of their skin, but by the content of their character. But Murray then goes on to note that in recent years an insidious current has developed that has chosen to reject Dr. King's dream and insist that content of character is nothing compared to the colour of someone's skin. It has been decided that skin colour is everything, and it perhaps could be argued that the lecturer in race, racism and ethnicity who sparked the debate on Question Time is one of those people, dismissing Fox's opinion as she did solely on the basis of his sex and race. Rachel Boyle and Laurence Fox both reported receiving significant criticism and abuse on social media in the aftermath of their exchange, with Fox even reporting death threats. Significantly, one aspect of these communications directly echoed the observations offered in Douglas Murray's book, with both of them receiving criticism for evoking the words and memory of Martin Luther King. At least one person pointed out the irony of Rachel Boyle having a MLK quote as her banner image, having questioned the validity of Fox's view specifically because of his skin colour, while another even proposed that she had appropriated MLK's spirit for hateful intent. But this was nothing compared to the scale of criticism and notifications Fox received after posting this tweet, which expressed solidarity with the Reverend King's perspective on character and skin, including from none less than Doctor Who herself, Jo Martin, who was unveiled as the latest actor to play the 56-year-old character the following week. Martin retweeted this tweet from Danny Lee Winter, the founder of the Act for Change project, the campaign for greater diversity in the live and recorded arts. And unless you want to entertain the retweets are not necessarily an endorsement game, then I think it is fair to say that Doctor Who thinks that Laurence Fox is a stupid, arrogant, entitled cunt. Which obviously is fair enough as far as it's fair enough, because as Daniel York Lowe pointed out on Radio 4, everybody in this country is entitled to their opinion. However, especially in the context of MLK's words, in my humble subjective opinion, it's not necessarily the best example to be setting for young fans, especially at a time when heated debates about identity politics have significantly infected the Doctor Who fan base, to the extent that that nerdy fanboys have been involving themselves in insidious hate campaigns directed at other members of their community who they perceive to be unequivocally sexist, racist and transphobic because they think that the Chibnall era is poorly written and distractingly PC. But I digress, although do feel free to find out more about that on the B-side. Anyway, one game that I'm intentionally not indulging during this video is anything that Laurence Fox has ever said or done a tiny bit problematic, especially if it's plucked entirely from context. And obvious time constraints aside, the reason I'm not playing that particular game is that this video isn't about Laurence Fox. This video is about attitudes expressed towards people who behave like Laurence Fox, and whether or not a trade union should call on its members to unequivocally denounce them. People like white privileged males, the gammon portion of the Question Time audience, women of colour who think that Meghan Markle's expensive PR team have been playing the race card, and Doctor Who fans who think that Series 12 is distractingly PC. Because in my humble subjective opinion, based on his documented words and actions, the chair of Equity's Minority Ethnic Committee may not be entirely convinced that people like Laurence Fox can actually experience race or sex discrimination. And setting aside a very long and infinitely complex discussion about the history, frequency, direction, victimology and impacts of incidents of racism and sexism in the UK, as this real-world critical incident case study helps to establish, clearly people who behave like Laurence Fox can and do experience discrimination on grounds of sex and race, which presumably is the primary reason why Equity have taken steps to distance themselves from their own committee's race-related unequivocal denouncements. Personally, I think it's unlikely that Fox will pursue a complaint. But using a recent real-world example from the world of Doctor Who, and for the benefit of any slow learners lurking at the back, let me explain why he definitely could. Joe Hill is a successful American author and comic book writer who, amongst other things, is responsible for the critically acclaimed Netflix series Lock and Key. He changed his name because he wanted to succeed on his own merits, but he is in fact the son of the multi-millionaire best-selling author Stephen King. So for the purpose of this case study, I'm going to propose that it's reasonable to describe him as privileged, white and male. Anyway, Joe generated some headlines recently after he told the following anecdote about an unsuccessful job application on the Brian Keane Horror Podcast.
Right. What's one thing you guys haven't tackled yet? The one thing you haven't had an opportunity to do yet that you want?
I'll tell you the one thing I wanted to do that I'll never get a chance to do. So like I'm a big Doctor Who geek, right? This is a true story.
Okay.
So I'm a huge Doctor Who geek. Watching Doctor Who, watching the David Tennant Doctor Who's with my boys was a really happy part of their childhood and me being a dad. And I had some ideas for Doctor Who and I really wanted to write for that show. And my screen agent got me a chance to pitch on it. So I spent a month and a half working on 3 pitches, and man, I have never imagined harder in my whole life. I mean, I just worked so hard on these things. And by chance, I actually wound up spending a weekend with Neil Gaiman. We were in the same place at the same time, and we wound up hanging out a lot, and he actually edited my pitches. He actually went through the pitches and was like, here's, do this, don't do that, this is a good idea, hate this idea, and I'm like, you couldn't ask for a better editor for, of course. And so I with trepidation, my heart in my mouth, I sent in my pitches, and a couple weeks passed, and I got, the email I got back said, we have never, let an American write Doctor Who. And if we were going to, we wouldn't start with you.
Oh my God. Are you
kidding me? Is that the most smoking rejection of all time?
Jesus.
Wow.
I mean, I feel like I just got kicked in the nuts and it's not even my pitch. I mean, who the fuck?
Wow.
So That would be my enemy for life.
So, firstly, fair play to Joe for taking such incredible ignorance entirely on the chin, which in my humble subjective opinion is the healthiest outlook to have. But nevertheless, if true, then that's quite a remarkable story. Not just because it would be an extremely rude and insensitive way to turn someone down for a job, but it would be incredibly stupid as well. Because if the independently wealthy son of a multimillionaire could have been bothered, then presumably he could have negotiated a tidy settlement from the BBC, because the reason they gave in writing for rejecting him was direct race discrimination, which, as I repeatedly spelt out in the first episode of this series, has been illegal in Great Britain since the 1970s. Just to clarify, nationality is included within the scope of race, which means that people like Meghan Markle are afforded just as much protection from discrimination from anyone in the media, including the BBC, that might have a problem with Yanks. And while we're on the subject of the Duchess of Sussex, clearly only she can know if the reason her family are moving to Canada is because she feels that she is being torn to pieces by a racist press. But those proposing this on her behalf haven't exactly provided the most convincing of evidence. Take British writer and broadcaster Afua Hirsch's much discussed op-ed for the New York Times, which proposed that the press had succeeded in their apparent project of hounding her out of Britain. And yet, the two most robust examples of possible overt racism that she provides actually fundamentally undermine her own arguments. Firstly, we have the example of a brooch worn by a minor royal in Meghan's presence, which was deemed to be racist, something which was specifically highlighted by the British press, directly leading to Princess Michael of Kent being forced to issue a grovelling apology, which was in turn dutifully reported on by this supposed scheming press. And then we have the infamous incident when a veteran BBC broadcaster brazenly compared the Duchess's recently born son to a monkey on social media. An act of such monumental and unequivocal career suicide that Danny Baker's unlikely explanation for what he described as a naive and catastrophic mistake actually begins to make sense. But it's irrelevant whether or not you believe his explanation, because the fact is that he was immediately and roundly condemned by every section of the British press, and within 24 hours his 20-year career with the BBC was over without so much as a final written warning. A zero-tolerance approach which stands in marked contrast to such recent incidents as the time the BBC opted to actually defend their decision to broadcast a pre-recorded joke from a Labour-supporting feminist comedian about throwing acid over people like Nigel Farage. Anyway, I'd never actually heard of Afua until researching this video, but she popped up with another informative contribution during a Sky News debate about the Question Time kerfuffle, which was sensitively titled, "Can White People Have a Valid Opinion on Race?"
And can I just bring some facts into this, because race and class are complicated, but there are facts that intersect. So, for example, and this is from David Lammy, the Black MP who did a review on race in the criminal justice system, there is greater disproportionality in the number of black people in prisons in the UK than in the United States, the country we all like to say is much more racist than ours. These disproportionate numbers, he said, represent wasted lives, a source of anger and mistrust, and a significant cost to the taxpayer. BAME individuals face bias, including overt discrimination in parts of the criminal justice system. If you're black, you're treated more harshly than if you're white.
And sure enough, a quick survey of US penal data confirms the fact that there is a much greater disproportionality between the number of men in prisons here in the UK than in the United States. If men were sentenced on a par with women, the male prison population would be less than 1/4 of its current size. Despite this, the political emphasis is for a more lenient, caring approach for women only, and the closure of women's prisons to make way for increasing numbers of male prisoners. Men clearly experience bias in this area, including overt discrimination, such as the recent example where a female judge brazenly informed a serial drink driver that she would have been straight down the stairs to jail if she had been a man. So perhaps Afua isn't necessarily best placed to have an unequivocally valid opinion on the criminal justice system. All of which is not to say that black, Asian and minority ethnic Britons don't experience racism, because of course they can and do. But when Laurence Fox proposed that that Britain is the most tolerant country in Europe. Presumably he was referring to various studies that appear to support this notion. And obviously one of the reasons that everyone is afforded the same legal protection is because racism can manifest in many different ways. Just by way of example, the first finding of race discrimination in Northern Ireland involved a white man who was severely harassed in his job because he was English. There are well documented examples of tensions between African and African Caribbean communities, and it is difficult to argue that race has not been a factor in various recent grooming gang scandals, including Manchester, which is just down the road from Liverpool. And yet, in the same week that a report revealed that Greater Manchester Police knew of grooming gangs sexually exploiting girls as young as 12 in plain sight, but did nothing because of fear of igniting racial tensions, Question Time didn't have enough time to feature a single question on that topic.
For fear of sounding racist, there's been horrific things have happened in Manchester and in towns all over the north of England, and we should be careful and use racism when it's there and it's obvious, and not call someone racist just because they don't agree with you.
Interestingly, another contributor to Sky's debate about whether white people are allowed to have an opinion on race was none less than the BBC's Director of Creative Diversity, June Sarpong, who offered this surprisingly narrow interpretation of what people like her mean when they talk about white privileged males like Laurence Fox.
Also, just to pick up on the privileged debate, I think often we sort of conflate the experience of all white men. Let's be very clear. The experience of privileged white men, as in those from elite backgrounds,
like Laurence Fox,
is very different to the experience of white working class men. And so I think what we're talking about here is saying that there are people, and so, let me finish, that there are people in society that life is just easier for because of the way the system has been. No. But you also have to be open to the fact that you might have blind spots.
In my humble subjective opinion, June is entirely correct in her belief that people like her do very frequently conflate the experience of all white men when they talk about white male privilege. And she makes an extremely valid and important point when she says that the experience of white privileged men from elite backgrounds can be very different indeed to the experience of white working class men. It's certainly true that there is a disproportionately high number of white men from privileged backgrounds sitting in seats of power and wealth, in a country where white working class boys are now 3 times more likely to leave school without qualifications than working class black girls. And it's fair to say that privileged women from elite backgrounds like Meghan Markle can have very different life experiences than working class people of any sex or colour. And to a lesser extent, the same can be said of perceived posho, privately educated people like Fox and Oxbridge graduate Afua Hirsch, who attended the same private fee-paying school as the fictional posho globetrotting Tomb Raider Laura Croft.
Hello, boys. You're all wet.
But as the Labour Baroness with a notoriously complicated, some would say grossly hypocritical view on who should be afforded the right to private education said earlier, one should always walk a mile in posho's shoes before unequivocally denouncing their opinion, because all sorts of people experience discrimination in all sorts of ways. And Laurence Fox, to his absolute credit, has previously put his head above the parapet to speak on behalf of a group of people that you very rarely hear about in places like the BBC. He recently talked about the 2-year legal battle with Doctor Who alumni Billy Piper, required to secure joint custody of his kids. I suspect that Fox would be happy to acknowledge that he was in a better position than some fathers when he entered the family court system, but nevertheless he has talked of how the experience brought him to the brink of financial and mental ruin. He is the latest in a long line of men, and indeed some women, to speak out about the secretive and adversarial nature of family courts. Fox could in fact be punished by a judge and even sent to prison if he talked about the specifics of his case, and he has made it clear that he has zero interest in playing the blame game with the mother of his children. He has described the experience as horrific and involving a mountain of legal fees on both sides that could have been spent on the future of their children. Piper engaged the services of the royal family's own preferred divorce lawyer known as the Steel Magnolia, and Fox has since spoken out in order to back calls for the introduction of no-fault divorces to avoid creating victims in the breakdown of relationships, and that family court cases cases should be held in public to ensure parties are subject to scrutiny and accountability over statements they present to the court, saying that there's an epidemic of silence among men who've experienced the family court system and the anonymity it provides to anyone with a perceived grievance to air. You end up in an adversarial legal system which encourages whoever it is who's feeling victimised, and the anonymity means there's no accountability for what they're saying, which doesn't encourage them to be sensible or truthful. Ultimately, you're in a process where you basically have to prove your legitimacy to parent your own children. It feels awful. If I'd backed down, things would have been different. I understand why some men feel so hopeless. They commit suicide and find themselves lying on the train tracks. Sobering statistics about family courts include that women are given residential custody of the children in 90% of cases. 40% of divorced women admit that they have no intention of allowing their ex to ever see their children again. And 50% of men who fight for custody will be accused of domestic violence. Obviously, some of these allegations will be legitimate, but inevitably false accusations can become common currency when no actual evidence is required. And as the Australian actress Amber Rudd recently highlighted, who would believe a man? Indeed, the accusation alone is sufficient for an automatic court order to be issued forbidding the man any further contact with wife or children. Nor is it required that there ever be an investigation of any kind to establish whether or not the accusations have truth. This tactic is reported to be commonly deployed, often encouraged by the woman's solicitor, since it considerably accelerates and simplifies the process with no possibility of being exposed. Men are extremely disadvantaged by a system that also routinely ignores breaches of visitation rights by the mother. And as Fox's story helps to highlight, it doesn't really matter whether they're the son of a builder or even heir to the throne of England. If a father finds themselves in a custody battle, they're in for the fight of their life. One that tragically not all survive. And on that sobering thought, I'll end with a quick glance at how the BBC reacted to the call to denounce a member of their primetime political debate panel for disagreeing with a black and minority ethnic woman who, by the way, also turned out to be a part-time employee of the BBC. As I mentioned earlier, they received over 250 complaints about that broadcast, but judging by their response, most of them had nothing to do with Laurence Fox and actually related to the makeup of the audience. Too gammon, apparently. And in fact, the nearest I could find to an official comment on the matter came from the BBC's Director of Creative Diversity, when directly responding to the question, is a white man allowed an opinion on anything to do with race? To be entirely honest, I'm not sure how to interpret the answer, but for the record, here it is.
Okay, on this one, it's very strange, and I think, Afua, you're going to jump down my throat in a moment. I'm quite torn, and I'll tell you why. I don't think the way that Laurence Fox presented himself helped, and the way he completely shouted down the audience member was symbolic of many of the issues that we talk about all the time in relation to privilege. And he couldn't possibly know what it feels like to be a person of colour in a country. Let me finish. Let me finish. What it feels like to be a person of colour in a country where you are the minority. However, I do think that when it comes to the inclusion debate, we have to figure out what the narrative is in terms of how we include white men into the conversation. Because for this stuff to be sustainable, and Jeff, you and I have spoken about this on occasion, for it to be sustainable, we have to figure out what that conversation is. And sometimes what happens is we immediately jump down the throat of anyone that voices this kind of opinion. And I don't necessarily agree with the opinion. I appreciate that. But I do believe that if we're going to have something that's sustainable in terms of inclusion, we'd better figure out what that conversation is.
It's this. Can we go home now?
Thank you.